Before we dive into these captivating stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to never miss our latest thrilling tales. If you enjoy stories that make you think and feel, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's begin. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. My best friend Sarah and I had packed our bags, eager for a weekend getaway. The sun had set hours ago, and we were driving through a desolate stretch of highway. The GPS warned us of no services for miles, but we brushed it off, laughing nervously at how isolated it felt. That laughter died quickly when our car sputtered, jerked, and came to a complete stop. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, the only light coming from the moon and stars above. As we sat there trying to figure out our next move, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over us. Someone was coming. But as the vehicle drew closer, a sense of unease settled in. It was an old, rusty truck, the kind you'd see in a horror movie. The engine roared like a beast as it pulled up alongside us. The driver, a man with a weathered face and a grin too wide, rolled down his window. "Need a ride, ladies?" he asked. Something about his voice sent chills down my spine. But we were desperate. Sarah hesitated, but I told her we didn't have a choice. We climbed into the truck, the smell of oil and cigarettes filling our noses. Little did we know, that ride would turn our night into a living nightmare. The truck's interior was as unsettling as its driver. Faded leather seats with mysterious stains, a dashboard cluttered with old maps and empty soda cans, and a faint but acrid smell of something metallic. The man introduced himself as Gus. "Been driving these roads for decades," he said with a chuckle. His grin never wavered, but his eyes were sharp, constantly darting to the rearview mirror where he could catch glimpses of us. "Where are you girls headed?" Gus asked. Sarah and I exchanged a quick look before answering vaguely, mentioning the next town. He nodded, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As the truck rumbled down the dark highway, Gus began talking. At first it was harmless chatter about the road, the weather, and his long-haul trucking days. But then his stories took a darker turn. He spoke of strange things he'd seen on this very highway. People walking aimlessly in the middle of the road, shadows that didn't belong to anything visible, and a legend about a cursed stretch of asphalt where travelers disappeared. Sarah whispered to me that we should have stayed with the car. I wanted to agree, but Gus suddenly fell silent. He grinned at us through the mirror. "You believe in fate, girls?" he asked. "Sometimes the road chooses you." His words hung in the air, suffocating and heavy. As the miles ticked by, I began noticing something odd. The landmarks, a lone gas station, a broken-down billboard, started repeating. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Sarah confirmed it. "We've passed that same gas station twice now," she said, her voice trembling. "Hey, Gus, are we going in circles?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He chuckled, but it was a low, sinister sound. "Don't worry, we're making good." "Time," he replied. His eyes locked on mine in the mirror, and for the first time, I saw something predatory in them. Sarah squeezed my hand. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. But how? We were in the middle of nowhere, and Gus didn't seem like the type to let us just walk away. The truck slowed as Gus took a sharp turn onto a dirt road. "Shortcut," he said casually, as if that explained everything. The road was rough, the truck bouncing over rocks and potholes. Trees loomed on either side, their branches forming twisted skeletal shapes in the headlights. Sarah and I exchanged a panicked glance. We knew this wasn't a shortcut, it was a trap. The truck came to an abrupt stop. Gus reached over and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Stay put," he ordered. Before we could protest, he stepped out, slamming the door behind him. We watched as he disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly. "Now's our chance," Sarah hissed. She reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. "Child locks," she groaned, panic rising in her voice. I tried my door with the same result. We were trapped. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there, the forest eerily silent around us. Then, in the distance, we heard it. A faint, high-pitched scream. It was impossible to tell if it was human or animal. Sarah and I froze, our breath shallow and quick. "What is he doing out there?" she whispered. Before I could answer, Gus reappeared, his face shadowed under the flashlight's beam. He climbed back into the truck without a word and started the engine. "Just a quick detour," he said, his voice too cheerful. Something dark and sticky glistened on his hands. We didn't ask what it was. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. Gus was humming now, a low, tuneless sound that set my teeth on edge. Sarah leaned close and whispered, "We need to distract him." "How?" I whispered back. But before she could answer, Gus spoke up. "You girls whispering secrets back there?" he asked, his tone light but his grip on the wheel tightening. "No," I lied, forcing a laugh. "Just talking about how we're lucky you came along." He glanced at me in the mirror, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, real lucky," he muttered. The way he said it made my stomach turn. Sarah gave me a look that said, "Stick to the plan." I nodded, though we didn't really have a plan, just a desperate need to get out. The truck veered off the dirt road, plunging deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches scraping against the truck's metal frame like nails on a chalkboard. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't right," she whispered. Gus just kept humming, oblivious to our growing panic. I spotted a sharp rock on the floor near my feet. Slowly, I reached down, careful not to draw Gus's attention. Sarah noticed and gave me a barely perceptible nod. If we couldn't open the doors, maybe we could smash the window and run. The problem was, we had no idea where we were, or if we'd make it out alive. As if sensing our thoughts, Gus spoke up. "You know, running wouldn't do you any good out here," he said, his voice eerily calm. "This forest, it's not what it seems." Sarah and I froze. He laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "People who wander in don't usually wander back out." The truck slowed to a crawl, and Gus gestured out the window. "See that?" he asked. In the dim light, I saw what looked like a tattered piece of fabric caught on a branch. "Belonged to the last person who tried to leave," he said with a grin. Panic surged through me. I gripped the rock tighter, feeling its jagged edges bite into my palm. Gus was distracted, staring out the window at the fabric. Sarah mouthed, "Now." I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to act. But before I could make my move, Gus slammed his foot on the brake, throwing us forward in our seats. "Change of plans," he said, his tone cold and final. "We're walking from here." Gus yanked open his door and stepped out, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. Sarah and I exchanged a terrified look. This was it, our chance to escape or the end of the road. My grip on the rock tightened as I prepared for what came next. With one swift motion, I brought the rock down on the window. The glass shattered, and the sound seemed to echo through the forest. Gus turned, his face a mask of rage. Sarah scrambled, through the broken window, pulling me with her. We ran, branches whipping at our faces and feet pounding against the uneven ground. Behind us, Gus's voice roared like thunder. But we didn't stop, not until the lights of a distant road came into view. If you enjoyed this story and want more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in our place? Stay tuned for more terrifying adventures. My most common run is Vancouver to San Francisco. It's an easy trip most of the time with very little challenge involved. I tend to prefer driving into the night because there's less traffic. Of course, driving around in the middle of nowhere during witching hour means I've seen my share of things. UFOs, Bigfoot, the works man. But none of that stuff has ever scared me nearly as bad as the people you see walking along the shoulder of the road, far from civilization. I noticed my first one on my junior run down south on the number 5. It was a lady in a blue summer dress, just strolling down the side of the highway underneath the full moon. Not a care in the world. Now we were on a stretch that was miles and miles away from anything in either direction, and I was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. She didn't even look up to acknowledge me, though. Instead, she just kept on, walking with a sort of vacant smile. I chalked it up to some hippie from the Oregon Trail hopped up on something from a nearby campsite and kept driving. But she was only the first. It's not every trip you spot them, but sometimes you see a few on a single go. It always struck me as strange because you never seem to see them during the day. Or maybe you do, but they don't stick out as much under the sun. Even so, once you know they're there, you'll start noticing the hell out of them whenever you're driving far from civilization in the dark. The other truckers call them moon wanders, but I prefer shoulder walkers, since that's always where they are. Almost like trains on a track, they walk that little white line to wherever they're going. They're different shapes and sizes, too. Men, women, tall, fat, ugly, pretty. Just folks like you'd see anywhere. Sure, they're creepy, but for a long time I didn't pay them any mind beyond noticing them on occasion in the split second that they were visible as I cruised past. But one night a few months ago, I passed by what looked like an old lady. She was in a hospital gown and looked just like someone on death row. Sunken, given up on life sort of eyes, frizzy white hair and pale skin. She was smiling just like her grandkids had called her name. Her pace was a slow shuffle along the shoulder, and just looking at her I could imagine the sound of her hospital slippers running just over top the gravelly road. I wanted to keep driving because, well, to be honest, she gave me the willies. But hell, she reminded me of my own sweet grandma. God rest her soul. So I brought my rig to a slow stop and, collecting up the flashlight I keep in my glove box, stepped out of the cab. I could hear her coming before I could see her as I'd driven a few meters ahead of her due to the long stop time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I could visualize her wrinkly feet in those hospital slippers, shuffling ever onward. Quickly I checked the Maps app on my phone and saw that the closest town to where we were was over 50 miles. No way this old lady was walking that. Putting my phone in my jeans, I held up my flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her footfalls. Hello, ma'am?" I called out, hoping that she would speak up. No such luck, just more scraping. My hairs were on edge now as I waited for her to enter into the dim light of my flashlight. I nearly cried out as the ghostly appearance came into view. Not because anything was different from before, just because she looked so much more sickly up close. "Ma'am, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere, you know?" She didn't say nothing, just kept smiling and moving steadily forward. Now my heart was beating hard. She's just senile. Senile, and she needs my help, I thought out loud. But my feet were frozen in place. They were going back to the truck, or they weren't moving at all. She was getting closer though, and as she reached within 10 feet or so, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wiggled in my direction like a grandma reaching for her grandchild's face. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything, just grinned at me with pale gums. My legs gave out, and as I fell onto my side, she reached down for me with surprising speed and dexterity. Before I knew what was going on, she had her bony fingers around my ankles and I was getting dragged down the road. Desperately, I pulled back, but her grip was superhuman, and the addition of my weight didn't seem to slow her walk in the least. She stared down at me with those beady, sunken eyes, mouth agape in a smile. I kicked at her with all the fight I had in me, and luckily connected with her jaw. To my horror, it was like kicking solid concrete. But luckily she let go despite having no visible injury. I crawled backwards towards the middle of the road, and she kept walking down the shoulder. Her hands fell back down to her side and her mouth closed into a tight-lipped smile. But her gaze stayed locked on mine as she slowly shuffled out of my flashlight's beam. I waited as the scraping bit by bit faded from my ears, and after what ended up being a half hour of stunned silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and go back to my rig. No sign of the lady, but when I climbed into my cab and sped down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still stuck on me. They probably had been the whole time as she walked away. The last I saw of her as I gunned it away was her thin, chapped, smirking lips. According to some other guys I know, I'm the first to try and interact with a shoulder walker, and if God is good, I'll be the last. Since then, I've seen plenty more strolling down the highway in the pitch dark. I even saw a kid once, but there ain't no way I'm ever stopping again for them. And if you're smart, you won't neither. Since that night, the shoulder walkers are always looking right at me when I drive past, which they never used to do. Almost like since that old lady saw me, they all did. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I'd not managed to get free. But I can rest easy knowing I've put my warning out there in public. Maybe I'll save a few folks with this story. It's funny how a city so alive during the day can feel like a void at night. After hours of navigating Melbourne's vibrant streets, I pulled over to rest in what seemed like the most unremarkable stretch of town. No streetlights, no passing cars, not even the faint hum of city life. When I switched off my truck's lights, the darkness was so dense it felt like it swallowed me whole. Sitting in that pitch-black silence, I realized just how lonely the road can be. But loneliness? That I could handle. It was the cold that threw me off. You see, it was summer. Warm, even at night. Yet, as I lay there in my truck, the chill seeped into my bones. I rolled over and over trying to shake off this unnatural cold, but it clung to me. Something about that night felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I convinced myself it was just exhaustion, a trick of the mind after a long day. Little did I know, it was only the beginning. It started as a faint glow, barely noticeable against the oppressive darkness. Then, out of nowhere, the cabin light flooded the space in a pale yellow. My heart jumped to my throat. The passenger side door, it was open, not wide open, but just enough to send a jolt of fear racing through me. My rig was brand new, meticulously maintained. That door wasn't faulty. It couldn't have opened on its own. I froze, my mind scrambling for answers. Was someone outside? Were they watching me, waiting for the right moment? Grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy pole used for tightening belts, I braced myself. My knuckles turned white as I gripped it, listening. The silence was deafening. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that something wasn't right. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped out into the night. My breath fogged up in the unseasonable cold as I circled the truck. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of life. Just me, my rig, and the suffocating emptiness. The road was barren, stretching into the horizon like an endless black ribbon. My heart raced as I scanned every shadow, every patch of darkness, expecting something, or someone, to emerge. But there was nothing. My truck stood alone, untouched. The passenger door was still slightly ajar, mocking me. Shaking my head, I slammed it shut and locked it again, double-checking every latch. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Or maybe I just didn't want to face the alternative, that I wasn't alone after all. Back in the truck, I tried to calm down, but sleep was out of the question. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the scene over and over. What if someone had been there? What if they were still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to drop my guard? The chill in the air grew sharper, almost suffocating. I wrapped myself in my blanket, but it was no use. The cold wasn't just physical, it was deeper, more unsettling, as though it was crawling under my skin. I must have drifted off eventually, because when I opened my eyes again, the cabin light was off. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that's loud in its own way, pressing down on you until you can't breathe. For a moment, I thought it was over. Just a bad dream, but the worst was yet to come. Morning broke, painting the world in soft hues of yellow and orange. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as sunlight spilled through the curtains. Stretching, I got up and parted them, eager to put the strange night behind me. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Right there, just a few feet from my truck, was a cemetery. Rows of weathered gravestones stood crooked in the earth, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. I hadn't noticed it the night before. How could I not have seen it? The unease from the previous night came rushing back, stronger, now as if the cemetery itself was mocking me for staying there. Panic took over. I didn't even think. Throwing on a shirt but nothing else, I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored it. Gravel sprayed behind me as I sped away from that cursed spot. My hands trembled on the wheel, and my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone chasing after me. But there was nothing. As the cemetery disappeared in the distance, the chill finally began to fade. The sun climbed higher, warming the cab and my trembling hands. Yet, the unease lingered. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something sinister. It's been weeks now, but the memory of that night refuses to leave me. I've told myself it was all in my head. The cold, the door, the cemetery. But deep down, I know better. Something was there. Something I can't explain. I haven't stopped driving. It's my livelihood after all. But I've changed. I avoid quiet stretches, keep the cabin lights on at all times, and never ever park near a cemetery. The road is a lonely place, but I've learned that sometimes loneliness is the least of your worries. Sometimes it's what you don't see that stays with you, and sometimes it's the places you don't notice until it's too late. It was a regular night in Chicago, and I was on my usual trucking route. The roads were quiet, save for the faint hum of engines and the occasional flash of headlights. The air was heavy, and the glow of the city faded into the distance as I took the less traveled road through the outskirts. Everything about the night felt normal, until it wasn't. My high beams caught something unusual up ahead. A car parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its interior dimly illuminated. I slowed my rig, my curiosity piqued. That's when I saw it. A young girl, barely visible through the shadows, was being beaten in the back seat. Fists swung in rapid succession, her face catching the brunt of each blow. My heart stopped. The world outside my cab narrowed to that horrifying scene. Instinct took over. I hit the horn, the blaring sound shattering the stillness of the night. The car jolted, as if startled by my presence, and sped off before I could get a clearer view of the driver. My hands trembled as I shifted gears, forcing my truck into pursuit. I've seen plenty on the road, fights, accidents, even a robbery once, but this was different. This was pure, unfiltered violence. The girl's lifeless resistance, her body slumping under the force of those hits, haunted my every thought as I chased the car. My headlights bathed their vehicle in light, exposing every grim detail. I could see the license plate clearly. It was a small victory, but I knew I had to act fast. They swerved recklessly, weaving through the empty lanes like a desperate animal trying to escape a predator. My horn blared again, and this time I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the rearview mirror. It was cold, emotionless. My adrenaline spiked, my grip tightening on the wheel. I dialed 911 with one hand, my voice frantic as I relayed the license plate and the direction they were heading. The dispatcher's calm voice felt out of place against the chaos unfolding. "Stay on them," they said, "but don't engage." Engage? As if I could ignore what I had just seen. The girl's face flashed in my mind again, bloodied and bruised. As the dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, the car veered suddenly down an unlit side road. My truck's size made it impossible to follow, and I slammed on the brakes, cursing under my breath. The taillights vanished into the darkness, leaving me with nothing but the hum of my engine and the pounding of my heart. I waited. Headlights, aimed down the road, hoping to catch any sign of them. Nothing. They were gone. The dispatcher assured me that the police had the information and would investigate. I'd done all I could, right? But the hollow feeling in my chest said otherwise. The next day, my phone rang. It was the police. They'd tracked down the car and spoken to the driver. Relief surged through me. Maybe they'd saved her. But then came the words that froze me in place. The driver claimed the girl was having a medical emergency, the officer explained, their tone clinical. They assured us she's fine. Fine? I replayed the scene in my head. The fists, the blood, the lifeless way she'd slumped under the blows. How could that possibly be fine? The explanation didn't sit right with me. Medical emergency? That wasn't what I saw. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself the police knew what they were doing. But the images lingered. Every time. I closed my eyes. I saw her face, bloodied and beaten. My truck's cab felt smaller, suffocating as my thoughts spiraled. What if they'd lied? What if the girl was still in danger? The questions clawed at me, refusing to let go. That night, sleep was elusive. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of her. She was sitting in the back seat, her face turned towards me, but her eyes were hollow, empty. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Suddenly the driver appeared, his cold eyes locking onto mine. He smiled, a sinister, knowing grin that made my blood run cold. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It felt too real, too vivid. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time I hit the road, I found myself scanning every car I passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, one night, as I drove the same route, my high beams caught something on the side of the road. It was her, or at least, it looked like her. She stood motionless, her face, pale and expressionless, staring directly at my truck. I slammed on the brakes, but when I looked again, she was gone. My chest tightened. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I started questioning everything. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen that night? Was it possible the driver's story was true? But deep down, I knew better. The girl's lifeless eyes, the driver's cold demeanor. It didn't add up. I tried contacting the police again, but they brushed me off, assuring me the case was closed. The frustration was maddening. It felt like I was the only one who cared about what had happened to her. Even now, months later, the memory of that night refuses to fade. Every time I take that route, I can feel her presence, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. I've stopped trying to explain it to myself or anyone else. The road holds its secrets, and some truths are too horrifying to uncover. All I know is that somewhere out there, a girl's story remains untold, and I can't shake the feeling that I'll see her again. Whether in my dreams or in the glow of my headlights, she's always there, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can hide in plain sight. It was a cold, quiet night. My friend and I had just wrapped up watching an intense NCAA game. The streets were desolate, and the thrill of the game was still buzzing in our heads. But as the clock ticked closer to 2 a.m., exhaustion began to settle in. We were driving back home, the road stretching endlessly before us, shrouded in darkness. That's when it hit us both. The urgent need to use the bathroom. We scoured for a gas station or a convenience store, but nothing seemed to be open at that hour. Finally, we spotted a flickering sign for a trucker stop. It wasn't ideal, but we figured it would do. Little did we know, stepping into that stop would change everything. The trucker stop was dimly lit, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the oppressive silence. There was something unsettling about it. A single truck sat idling in the lot, and another vehicle, an old sedan, looked abandoned. Its tires deflated, its windows clouded with dirt. My friend and I exchanged a glance, half joking about the setting being straight out of a horror movie. Laughing it off, we entered the restroom. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. We hurried, eager to get back on the road. As we were finishing up, we both froze. A woman's voice drifted in from outside, low and haunting. "Billy, where are you?" "Oh, Billy," she called, her tone slow and dreamlike. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the tone itself, but the way her voice carried, as if it wasn't entirely real. My friend whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my pulse quickening. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves it was just a trucker's wife or someone looking for their kid, but deep down we both felt something was wrong. Then it happened. The restroom door creaked open. We froze, holding our breath. The door didn't swing wide, just a crack, before it closed again with a quiet click. 6 seconds. That's all it took. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear mirrored in my friend's eyes. The voice continued outside, now closer. "Billy, "Where are you?" she repeated, her words echoing eerily. We stood there, paralyzed, as the sound of slow footsteps moved past the restroom door. Gathering every ounce of courage, my friend whispered, "Let's check if she's gone." Reluctantly, I agreed. We cracked open the door just enough to peek outside. What we saw sent a chill down my spine. The woman was walking away, her movements unnaturally stiff. She wore a long dress, faded and tattered, her hair hanging over her face like a curtain. Her voice was still low, almost mechanical, as she called for Billy. She didn't seem to notice us, but the broken-down sedan in the lot suddenly didn't feel so abandoned anymore. Fear took over. "Let's go," I hissed, my voice trembling. We bolted out of the restroom, the cold night air hitting us like a wall. We sprinted to our car, not daring to look back. The woman's voice continued, now fainter as we ran. "Billy, where are you?" My hands fumbled with the keys, panic setting in as I struggled to unlock the door. My friend kept glancing back, his face pale with terror. Finally, we got the doors open and dove in, slamming them shut behind us. I turned the key in the ignition, and the car roared to life. We sped out of the lot, gravel flying beneath the tires. As we pulled onto the highway, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The woman was still there, standing motionless in the middle of the lot, her head tilted slightly as if watching us leave. But what unnerved me the most was the other car. Its headlights flickered once, twice, and then went dark again. We drove in silence, the adrenaline coursing through our veins. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, my friend broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. I had no answer. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Who was she? What was she doing there? And why did her voice sound so wrong? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. When we got home, the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't sleep, replaying the night's events over and over in my mind. The image of the woman, her stiff movements and haunting voice was burned into my memory. My friend called the trucker stop the next day, hoping to get some answers. But the person on the other end said the stop had been closed for weeks due to renovations. There shouldn't have been anyone there. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a prank, a lost soul, or something far more sinister? All I know is that I'll never set foot in another trucker stop after dark. Sometimes when the world falls silent at night, I swear I can still hear her voice, faint and distant, calling out for Billy.